The twin blade weapon category is one that I have very mixed opinions on. They do a lot of things really well, like having good synergy with the multi-hit talismans. Those two-handed light attacks and heavy attacks just hit so many times in quick succession. And having all these talismans alongside a thorny cracked tier can make for a very obvious pairing. They also do probably get the best jumping attack in the game in that power stancing jumping attack. And they also do have the most weapon skill options. They have everything for smaller weapons, poking attack types of weapons, and even some polearm types of skills. Now, unfortunately, they still have a bunch of downsides. One, despite them having all these amazing types of skills, none of them are really optimally paired with the twin blade. Every single one of these weapon skills are just going to get more damage with a different class, but obviously having all the options is really good. It still would have been nice if they had their own unique skill, but another reason why I don't really like them much is that they probably have the worst stance breaking potential in the entire game as well. These two-handed light attack combos literally do less stance damage than a straight sword and a curved sword light attack combo. Like, these things are hitting multiple times and have longer animations than these weapons. I don't know why they're doing less stance damage, and even their charged heavy attacks, as many times that it actually does hit, they only do 33 stance damage, which is just as much as a straight sword and curved sword charged heavy. And even though the power stancing jumping attacks are really good, the rest of the power stancing combo is not that good. I'd much rather just have them two-handed for like basically every other type of attack. And I do also feel that they're very reliant on the multi-hit talismans too. If you don't have things like the sword insignia, Millicent's prosthesis, and the thorny cracked tier, it feels like you're just lacking so much more damage. And it's to the point where I just rather have any other different type of smaller quick weapon. But as you'll probably see on this list and throughout all the gameplay, some of these twin blades can just make for very broken options if you just do build around them correctly. Now, there are only 8 in total, and we are going to rank all of them from worst to best based on how useful they are in PvE. Now, one of the annoying things about these twin blades is that you can only get one of each per playthrough. So if you actually wanted to go with a power stance build, you're going to have to end up using multiple of these anyway. But yes, without the way, let's just get started. Starting off at the bottom, the Gargoyle's Black Blades, which every single one of these black gargoyle weapons, except for the greatsword, are just downright terrible. They all get awful scalings, some of the worst range, terrible damage, also get split holy damage, and they're just stuck with non-unique skills and don't have the ability to be infused. Like, I don't mind them if they had like a reskinned version of a skill and had like a cool destined death effect or a black flame effect, which is like what the Gargoyle's Black Blade does have. But I don't know why some of the other ones, including the Gargoyle's Black Blades, just don't get anything good or unique at all. Like, I guess it's pretty decent strength scaling, but every other type of infusible twin blade can just get more damage with a strength type of build, and just also get more range and just have more versatility. So yeah, there's basically like no reason to use this twin blade at all. At number 7, the regular normal twin blade. Now, this one is not a bad weapon by any means, but it's just outclassed by almost every other twin blade in the game because those ones can just get more damage with basically every single infusion. It does scale better off dexterity, and even like the strength-based ones can also scale better off dexterity. I think the major use of the twin blade is to be power stance alongside the Godskin peeler with a bleed type of infusion, because as I mentioned, you can only get one of each twin blade per playthrough. So if you actually wanted to power stance with the Godskin peeler, you only have the option between the Black Steel twin blade and the regular twin blade with these bleed types of infusions. Now, the thing is, the strength type of bleed build with the Gargoyle's twin blade and the Twins Night Sword are just gonna perform better as they just do more damage. And also the Black Steel twin blade does actually out damage a twin blade with a dexterity build as well, but that one is in the DLC. So like the only real use of the twin blade is like a nice early game option, and then you're just probably gonna replace it anyway. Number 6, the Black Steel Twin Blade, which is one of 2 Twin Blades from the DLC. The other one being the EUPORIA, and both of them do have some split faith scalings and some split holy damage. Now, this one actually can be infused. So actually going into the faith stat and going with a sacred infusion kind of doubles down into the scaling, and you're just going to get the most amount of damage with this type of build. You can also pair this alongside many different types of faith buffs, and you're just going to get bonus damage because that's how the Black Steel weapons actually work. So it can potentially result in the highest damaging twin blade in the entire game, but that's only going to be with a faith build and a sacred infusion, which obviously is doing holy damage. And I think the EUPORIA kind of just outclasses that anyway, because when you actually gain the luster effects of the EUPORIA, it literally does outdamage the Black Steel twin blade. But obviously having an infusible one means you actually can switch back and forth between flame art and sacred. So when you're going through the base game and fighting all those holy resist enemies, you could probably just leave it with a flame art infusion the entire time. But if you're going to be doing that, then I'd rather go with the Gargoyle's Twin Blades or the Godskin peeler, because those are just going to get more damage with that infusion. Especially because it does get the exact same moveset as the Godskin peeler, with those heavy attacks are just really nice pokes. But the Godskin peeler does that exactly and just better as well, because it can just do more damage. Now, if you actually did want to use the EUPORIA and probably have it in a power stancing build, you could probably pair it alongside the Black Steel Twin Blade, and it could perform pretty well there. But the EUPORIA doesn't really perform as well in terms of a power stancing build, because it doesn't really gain the luster effects as nicely. And once again, you kind of just limited into just going into holy damage. Whereas like I feel like the major benefit of having a faith infusion is that you can go on back and forth between different types of elements. So although it's a perfectly fine weapon and it can make for very broken builds, as you probably see in the gameplay, just optimally speaking, it just doesn't have as many uses as the other ones do. Number 5, the Twinned Nightsword, which is one of two separate strength-based twin blades in this game, the other one being the Gargoyle's Twinblades. Now that one is just going to directly outclass it, has the exact same moveset, but it just gets more damage in every single infusion. Now the Twinned Nightsword can be acquired earlier in the game, doesn't require you having to kill any enemies. It also weighs a bit less, has less requirements, and has more range, but the weight and range difference aren't that much more to warrant me having to use it over the extra damage that the Gargoyles gets. But as I've been mentioning, and as I'm going to mention, you can only get one of these twin blades per playthrough. Like the best twin blade jumping attack build in the game is going to be something paired alongside the Gargoyle's twin blades. Ideally getting two of them, but being they can only get one per playthrough, the Twinned Nightsword is going to be your next best bet. So whether you actually want us to go to a bleed infusion or not, using the Gargoyle's Twinned Nightsword setup is just going to be the option for you. So even though I do consider it to be very useful, it's still not going to get that much higher, because once you do go to New Game Plus or acquire a second Gargoyle's Twin Blade, it's essentially useless. Number 4, the ELEONORA'S POLEBLADE. Now I did an entire playthrough today on stream using this weapon skill from start to finish. Did decently in the first half, but it did amazingly in the second half of the game, and that's because I actually had the multi-hit talismans and the Thorny Cracked tier. Once I acquired those buffs, this weapon performed a lot better, which is actually going to be true for all the twin blades, but especially ELEONORA'S. Now, as I've been mentioning, the optimal paths for twin blades are going to be power stancing jumping attacks and heavy attack builds. And if you want to go with those things, the ELEONORA'S POLEBLADE is not it. It does get a unique charged heavy attack that is a little bit slower than all the other twin blade heavy attacks, but that is because it actually swings an extra time, so it can actually result in the highest damage. But the thing is, if you want to go the charged heavy attack build, the Godskin pillar still outdamages it in a faster animation. And there will also be things like the EUPORIA as well that could just do it better, because that one is the highest damaging twin blade. And when it comes to power stancing jumping attack builds, being that it's not the highest damaging one, it's not going to really make the most amount of sense. Now, it actually does come with some passive bleed, and obviously these jumping attacks are going to proc status effects really quickly, but even then, if you wanted to go with a blade build, having a bleed infused Godskin pillar and another type of weapon is just going to perform better. It would just do more damage and just do more bleed build up, but the skill is going to be its best and biggest use, but it still is somewhat niche. Now, as I mentioned, this skill does not really perform well if you don't have the multi-hit talismans, but when you do, the damage is actually pretty decent. It does actually have you get stuck in a longer animation, so against enemies that attack really quickly and don't get staggered easily, it's not going to perform that well at all. But against these smaller enemies that can get stun locked, it performs amazingly, like it's really good. And it also does do over 60 stance damage with the entire skill combo, which it is a pretty long animation, but the fact that it's so easy to use and it can result in a nice stun lock against all these smaller types of enemies is just basically a free kill and a free stance break. It might be a bit inconsistent sometimes against these smaller enemies because it might just overshoot the target and you just end up missing. So it is like a nice skill to have. It's good utility against smaller enemies. It's good if you have longer openings because it's going to stance break really quickly, which, as I mentioned earlier, twin blades are terrible at stance breaking with their light attacks and heavy attacks. So if I am going to go with a power stancing blade type of build, I would actually throw on the ELEONORA'S POLEBLADE in your main hand. Now you're basically going to be using the power stancing jumping attack the entire time. If you have smaller openings, longer openings, it's just going to be like the optimal method, but it's probably not going to be as efficient to use it against smaller enemies, and that's where the ELEONORA'S POLEBLADE does come in handy. There are some skills that can emulate this, like spinning slash, but I think ELEONORA'S just does it so well. But I still think it's like a bit outclassed by that power stancing build, and potentially even outclassed by just like heavy attack builds with the Godskin peeler, because that one can just get more damage, but it does actually have the use of just doing a bit more stance damage because of its skill potential. I always have a hard time ranking this weapon, but it is really good either way. Number 3, the Gargoyle's Twinblade, which is the highest damaging twin blade in the entire game. And if you wanted to go with these jumping attack power stance builds, the Gargoyle's Twinblade is probably just going to be your best option. Now, it does have the worst range in class, and it also is tied for the heaviest twin blade too, but it's not that much and it's not really that noticeable. So I honestly would use it every single time. Now, you can only get one of these per playthrough. So if you actually did want to have them power stance, you're going to have to go into New Game Plus or just use another different type of twin blade. Now, bleed infusions are very popular because the jumping attacks can just proc them really quickly. But honestly, just going with like this regular strength infusions are just good enough. And every single time that you go up against enemies that are just weaker to bleed, you can just switch back to a bleed infusion and you can just go back and forth every single time, because bleed infusions, you still retain a really good strength scaling. Now, this type of playstyle means that you have to have the Twin's Nightsword in your offhand, at least for in regular new game. Now, a lot of people might put the Gargoyle's Twinblades at number 1, and it definitely is deserving of being number 1 because of these power sensing builds. But I just think like the next two options just have a bit more uses in my opinion, hence them being higher. But the Gargoyle's Twinblade is definitely S tier. Number 2, the Godskin Peeler, to what I consider the best infusible twin blade in the game. Now, no, it doesn't get as much damage as the Gargoyle's twin blade on basically every single type of infusion, but I consider it to be a bit more useful for a few different reasons. One, does have more range and it weighs a bit less. It also is going to be a dexterity based twin blade, so it actually does have better synergy with the ELEONORA'S POLEBLADE if you wanted to power stance alongside that. This one is going to be the optimal option, but I think the major reason is that it performs better than all the other infusible twin blades as a two-handed option. Now, as I mentioned, with two-handed twin blades, they get pretty poor stance damage and they get pretty poor DPS, but if you pair them alongside the multi-hit talismans, they just turn into absolute machines. And going with these charged heavy attacks, specifically with the Godskin Peeler, it can just make for broken builds because the Godskin Peeler actually gets a unique heavy attack, and that in the last part of the attack results in a poke, and this just makes it just do so much more damage because obviously piercing damage is amazing and counter attacks exist, so it can literally just be the highest damaging heavy attack out of all the twin blades. So I just think that's the main reason why I just have it above the Gargoyle's twin blades. That's because it's the best two-handed option, it has the best synergy with the ELEONORA'S POLEBLADE, and it also just has a bit more range, a bit lighter, and it's also easier to acquire than the Gargoyle's twin blade too. And at number 1, the EUPORIA. Now, if you wanted to go with its power sensing jumping attack builds, the EUPORIA is going to do it really well, but I still think you're better off just going with an infusible twin blade because you're not locked into one particular element and obviously have access to things like bleed and buffs like Crackblade. Now, the EUPORIA can be the highest damaging twin blade in the entire game, but it is just holy damage, which for the base game, it doesn't really mean much due to there being a lot of enemies that are holy resist. But the main reason why the EUPORIA does get number 1 is purely because of its unique effect and its weapon skill. When you actually do hit with the weapon a few times, just like one charged heavy attack or a couple of light attacks, it actually does buff the weapon with this like luster effect, and you actually can stack it up to 2 times. And once this buff is actually attained upon using the skill, it turns it into a projectile. And this projectile, when the buff is actually at ×2, is like one of the better projectiles in the game. The thing goes really far, does amazing damage, you can track with it, and at point blank range, it can just shred enemies and just do like over 60 stance damage as well. Now, I think the most underrated part about this is that the buff lasts such a long time, and you can remove the weapon and still retain the buff as well. You can just hit like a random trash mob a few times, gain the buff, it's gonna last like over 1.5 minutes, and you can just like walk into a boss room and then just like use the skill, or you can just walk into a room full of enemies and just clear them all out in an instant. Like, just the ability to be able to have this projectile like on demand is kind of just insane. Like, it's so easy to just gain access to this projectile. Now, it's not to say that it's actually perfect, because as I did mention, if you wanted to go with these power sensing jumping attack builds, the EUPORIA is not going to be that good because it doesn't actually gain the stacks of this effect that quickly. And also, if you have a power stance and you use the skill, it removes the buff of both weapons. And also, the skill can be a longer animation that doesn't get hype armor. You can cancel it, but if you do cancel it, you have to gain the buffs again, which is like a small little downside. But yeah, if you guys haven't used the EUPORIA, it is going to be an amazing weapon. And I've been playing with this weapon a whole bunch, especially after the buff. And this thing is just ridiculous. I just consider it to be the best twin blade in the entire game. And honestly, it doesn't really matter how you build around it. It's just going to be an amazing weapon. Anyway, that's now done. The Twinblades were by far the hardest weapon class to rank because you can only get 1 each per playthrough. And with how good the power stancing builds are, it just made it really hard to try and rank them, especially due to how many different ways you can build around the Twinblades, and every single one can just be like just as good as one another. So I'm sorry if it did feel like a bit scuffed, but either way, like, you can find success with almost every single one of these Twinblades here, except for the Gargoyle's Black Blade. That one sucks. They only differ just like very slightly, and the whole thing is just like nitpicking at this point. So don't get too invested as to how I ranked them. It honestly doesn't really matter that much. What I said about the weapons is what actually has merit. But as for the next video, we are going to rank the axes from worst to best, which there are about like roughly 18 or 19 of them, which I know is not that popular of a weapon class, but it's just next on the list. So we're just gonna go cover that one. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.